Hell is not what anyone imagines. It is not fire. It is not screaming. Not the theatrical agony of medieval paintings. Not the particular pageantry of brimstone that humans spent centuries insisting on with such concentrated enthusiasm. Hell, in its actual form, is quieter and stranger than any of that. It is an administrative district of chosen suffering, a bureaucracy of guilt operating at extraordinary scale. On the morning that everything changes, it is running exactly the way it is supposed to run, which is to say that every soul inside it is exactly where they put themselves. The soul in the lower corridor has been here for what amounts to 3 centuries of Earth time. She stands in the kitchen of a house that no longer exists, replaying the moment she said the wrong thing to someone she loved and that someone walked out, and she never fixed it. She replays it on a loop. She has replayed it roughly 14,000 times by now. She has chosen this. No devil dragged her here in chains. No judge handed down a sentence. No bureaucratic process assigned her to this corridor in this wing of this district. She arrived under her own conviction, guilt first, and built the loop herself. That is how hell works. It has never been otherwise. He watches from the doorway. The archangel, Samael, called Lucifer, called the devil, called a great many things across the long, slow count of his time doing this, watches the woman replay the conversation for the 14,000 and some odd time and does not intervene. He does not comfort her. He does not explain to her what she is doing. She has to arrive at the understanding herself, or not at all. That is the principle in its operational form, the philosophy stripped to its essential working parts. Free will is sacred enough to honor even when it is actively destroying you. Even when you are the one doing the destroying, even then he has governed this domain across millennia, across the rise and fall of the civilizations that built the civilizations that eventually named themselves humanity, across longer than the imperium of man has existed, and the imperium of man is 10,000 years old. Billions of souls, all of them self-sorted, all of them here because they chose guilt over resolution and could not yet find the door to the other side of it. The number is staggering if a person tries to hold it all at once. The first of all angels has stopped trying. He knows the ocean's nature. He governs it. He trusts that the process is sound, and that has always been enough. The morning that everything changes, something touched the edge of his domain. Not a knock, not a breach in the administrative sense, not an unauthorized soul through the intake corridors, not a celestial making an unscheduled collection, a resonance, a frequency bleeding in from somewhere adjacent, and the nature of that frequency was familiar, the way a word in a foreign language is familiar when it shares a root with a word already known. He recognized what it was built from. Suffering made dimensional. The inner life of conscious beings given form and mass and address. His domain was built from the same material, but his domain was governed. Whatever was bleeding through the edge of his jurisdiction was vast and directionless, and it roared the way a flooded river roars, all that force with no channel and no shore, and it was pulling at the boundary of his domain with the tide's complete indifference to what it pulled. No guilt at its center, which would have been legible. No intention toward anything, which would have been workable. Just appetite, enormous and unstructured, scaled to a dimension he could not immediately place. He crossed to the boundary and stood at the edge of it, and the resonance grew stronger, and for the first time in longer than he could calculate, something reached into the certainty he had built across all those millennia and made it uncertain. Something on the other side of that frequency was suffering at a scale that made his entire domain look like a waiting room. In the 41st millennium, above a hive world, at the outer edge of the cicatrix maledictum's influence, a tier opened in real space. The Inquisition's monitoring stations registered it simultaneously. Not a warp rift, not a Jella field failure, not a demonic incursion point of any documented type. The instruments produced readings that contradicted each other and contradicted themselves. The variety of measurements that appears when the category of event has no entry in the reference library. Something fell through the tear at a velocity that violated the physics of real space in at least 3 distinct ways. The tear sealed behind it in the same instant. The event lasted 4 seconds and left no trace except a crater in the ferrocrete of a ruined promontory above the burning hive. Lucifer landed there, on the remains of what had once been an observation platform before the siege had made observation platforms into something that resembled optimism. The impact cratered the ground around him in a ring. He stood. There was a body at the far edge of the platform, a soldier in the uniform of the Astra Militarum, 3 weeks dead. He registered it with the part of his attention that ran continuously in the background, the part that assessed the guilty, the suffering, the already gone. The soldier fell in none of those categories. The soldier was simply absent. He noted this as a data point about the world he had arrived in and looked at the city below. The hive was burning in at least 3 separate sectors. The siege had the shape of something that had been ongoing for a very long time. His celestial senses attuned to desire and guilt, and the emotional architecture of conscious beings across every dimension he had ever touched, registered what surrounded him, and went quiet the way a measuring instrument goes quiet. This was not hell. This was not Earth. This was somewhere he had never been, and the suffering pressing in from every direction was unlike anything in his entire experience, which was long and had included many terrible things. The suffering in his domain was authored, each piece of it traceable to a specific guilt, personal and directed inward, pointed toward something even when the soul inside it could not see what it pointed toward. The suffering here was not authored, it was ambient, enormous, and it was being consumed by something he could feel at the edges of everything vast and present, and entirely unconcerned with what it ate. The smell arrived, promethium and ash, and the acrid metallic trace of lassire, and underneath all of it something that was not chemistry at all, the raw psychic pressure of the warp bleeding through, wherever the great scar of the cicatrix maledictum drew close enough to press against real space. Far below his position, Astra Militarum artillery was trading fire with something in the lower districts of the hive. The sky above the city was the color of old metal, lit intermittently by the exchange. The sounds were enormous and constant, and had the quality of sounds that have run long enough that everyone within earshot has stopped hearing them as separate events. He had governed sin and desire, and the consequences of free will for long enough that almost nothing surprised him anymore. The Lord of Hell looked out at the burning hive, at the war below it and the scar in the sky above it, and recognized after a moment what he was feeling. Not alarm. Not fear. Something simpler and stranger, bafflement. "Well," he said to no one in particular, because there was no one on the promontory, "this is new. Before we go any further, and it's about to escalate, fast, which character from any universe do you think the warp would have the hardest time figuring out what to do with? Because right now, I've got a very strong candidate. Drop your pick in the comments. I'll get to every one of them. Okay, back to the apocalypse." He stood on the ruined promontory above the burning hive, and looked at the war below him for approximately 45 seconds before the war decided to come to him instead. The sound reached him first. An irregular cadence of corrupted voices raised in something that had started as devotional chanting and been stripped of its last intelligible syllable, leaving only the rhythmic urgency underneath. Then the figures crested the approach. 2 dozen, 3 dozen, more, moving with the forward lean of people who had given something essential away in exchange for velocity, chaos cultists. He recognized the category by their eyes, not their weapons. Where there should have been a person's organizing desire, there was a borrowed appetite wearing human architecture. Whatever they had wanted before had been replaced. Their autoguns and lasguns opened up the moment they saw him. He stood still for 3 seconds while the fire hit. The impact of autogun rounds against Archangel physiology was not nothing. It was roughly the experience of standing in aggressive hail while wearing a coat that cost considerably more than the ammunition being fired at it. Not danger, not comfortable either. He looked down at his jacket, which was acquiring new damage in addition to the damage already on it, and then looked back up at 3 dozen people who were shooting at him and discovering that this was not going as they had planned. The one with the plasma gun was different. The round hit him in the chest and knocked him back 2 steps. He straightened. He looked at the jacket. The jacket was not going to recover from this. "Right," he said to no one who was listening to anything except their own fear. "That is enough of that." He moved. The first 3 cultists were put down in as many seconds, not killed, disarmed, their weapons pulled away by a telekinetic snap, their bodies deposited against the promontory wall with enough force to make the point, and not enough to break anything necessary. 2 more were pinned under invisible pressure, fixed to the ferrocrete with the flat, efficient authority of someone who had dealt with worse nuisances than this on a routine basis for several thousand consecutive years and found the repetition mildly aggravating. 6 seconds, 5, neutralized. The rest of the assault slowed without quite stopping. The lesser daemons did not slow. They came from the margins, in the flickering half-presence of things that had learned never to hesitate around human mortals, and saw no reason to revise the policy. 2 of them, each small by the standards of what this galaxy could produce, each saturated with the warp-adjacent wrongness he was already learning to recognize as structural rather than incidental. The first demon lunged. The Archangel caught it barehanded. He did not know the banishment rites of this cosmos. He had not been here long enough to learn them, and there was something conceptually strange about the idea that banishment required a ritual rather than a function. What he had instead was something more fundamental. He knew what the demon was made of, which was emotion, and he had handled emotion as a working material for longer than this world had been burning. He tightened his grip on the demon's essential nature, his hands lit with celestial light that did not scorch the air, but seemed to clarify it, the way good light clarifies a dark room by revealing what was always there. The demon came apart in his grip and was gone. The second demon watched this. He tried instinctively that reach he had always used, the one that looked for the person inside. There was no person inside. There was the warp, wearing a shape it had borrowed from something that no longer had an owner. The demon reversed direction and was also gone. From behind a section of blown-out wall that had formerly been part of a generatorium annex, a sergeant in the uniform of the Astra Militarum was watching all of this through a sighting scope with a threat assessment display in the lower corner. The display had been cycling through classifications for the last 40 seconds without landing on one. Not a space marine. Wrong profile, wrong equipment. No warp signature on instruments calibrated specifically to detect exactly that. Not a demon. It had just expelled 2 lesser daemons from real space using nothing except its hands, and had been standing in the cleared zone it made from this assault, apparently undamaged, surrounded by stunned Chaos cultists who were reconsidering their commitments without needing to be asked to. The sergeant lowered the scope, opened a secure Vox line, began to talk. The astropathic report that emerged from the hive's surviving relay infrastructure was fragmented. 3 relay nodes had gone down in the preceding hour, and what arrived at the receiving end came in pieces. The pieces were sufficient. Unclassified entity. Warp-adjacent arrival event, approximately 15 hours prior. Resistant to auto-gun, lasgun, and plasma fire. Not drawing on the warp as a power source, no warp signature detectable on instruments calibrated for that measurement, not consistent with demon, xenos, or rogue psyker classification. Engaged Chaos cultist force, size approximately 34 personnel, and neutralized non-lethally. Expelled 2 lesser daemons from real space via direct physical contact. Method, unclassified. Current threat posture toward Imperial forces. UNON. Classification pending review. Priority anomaly. Escalation trigger. Automatic. Routing. Ordo Malleus. He stood in the settling dust of the assault and opened his celestial senses fully, without filtering, the way he always did when he needed to understand an environment rather than simply observe it. What came back was wrong in a way that went past the wrongness of the city and the wrongness of the war and into something structural. In his domain, every suffering entity was a self, a specific person with a specific guilt and a chosen loop, a wound at the center of the loop that could, if approached with sufficient patience, eventually be named and released. He could reach into any soul in hell and find their name, find the exact shape of what they could not put down. The damned were unmistakably themselves even at their worst. That was what made the governance possible. That was what gave the work its point. What pressed in from every warp-touched corner of this hive was not that the lesser daemons had not been souls. They had been appetite assembled into a body's shape, desire carried past the point where it remembered having a person attached to it. No guilt at the center, no self to reach, no resolution to offer, because there was nothing left that retained the capacity to want resolution. They were what happened to wanting when wanting went long enough without governance that it stopped being a feeling and became a force of nature. He found this disturbing in a way he did not yet have language for, and he was a being who had worked in human suffering as a vocation for longer than this planet's star had been shining. Something struck him in the back with the sharp, flat flash of a lasgun round. He turned. A squad of Astra Militarum infantry had taken position 40 meters down the promontory approach, weapons trained on him. The soldier at the front had a fist raised. Hold fire, assessing the assessment, judging by the set of the soldier's shoulders, was not going well. Lucifer looked at the squad. He looked at the raised fist. He considered briefly the general principle of having arrived by accident in a war where both sides were now shooting at him. "Oh," he said levelly, "of course you are." The figure who arrived at the promontory the following morning came without announcement and without haste, which was its own kind of announcement. Grey armor, marked at the pauldron with the inquisitorial seal, a skull bisected by a stylized letter worn silver against grey, a helm that sealed the face completely, Halbleck, a force sword at the hip, its blade dormant, but present the way all weapons are present, which is to say, constantly. A data slate held in the left hand, Lucifer's last confirmed coordinates already open on the screen, cross-referenced against the astropathic report and annotated with 17 classification attempts that had each been dismissed as the data refused to fit them. A kill team fanned out behind the grey-armored figure, in the practiced spread of people who had done this before and fully expected today to proceed like every other time. The Ordo Malleus specialized in daemons. They had arrived with everything the Inquisition brought to a demon: stormbolters, sanctioned psychers, demon-bane blades, and absolute certainty. The grey-armored figure had already drafted the opening line of the after-action report in their head. It began with Priority 1 Warp Incursion, neutralized. It had always begun that way. It had always ended the same. Lucifer was standing on the promontory, watching them come, with the attentive stillness of someone who has seen this kind of arrival before. The certainty, the equipment, the specific quality of purpose that comes from institutions old enough to have stopped questioning their premises. Warp entity, the Inquisitor said, their voice flat and amplified by the helm's vox. By the authority of the Ordo Malleus, you are to submit to immediate containment and classification. Non-compliance will be met with lethal force. Lucifer regarded them for a moment. Is there a version of this where we skip to the interesting part? The storm bolters opened up. The bolter rounds were a different category from lasgun fire. Each one was a small explosive, delivering its payload on impact, designed to breach power armor and reduce demon flesh. And against archangel physiology, they accomplished roughly the same thing that lasgun rounds had. They scored the jacket further, and communicated very effectively that the people behind the weapons were serious. He was willing to grant them that they were serious. He stood in the stream of fire for several seconds and let them be, because this was how the opening always worked. People needed to establish the facts before they could move past them. The sanctioned psyker in the kill team extended and screamed. The psychic blast hit him like a pressure change behind both eyes, the kind of sharp interior shift that arrives when altitude changes faster than the body expects. Not pleasant. He raised a hand to his temple with the expression of someone mildly interrupted in the middle of a thought, and the psyker, who had never gotten that response from anything they had screamed at, recalibrated their threat assessment involuntarily and in real time. Then the Inquisitor drew the force sword and crossed the distance. The blade was different, psychically charged, saturated with a force that operated on the layer of reality where his own nature lived. When it cut across his forearm, it cut, not deeply, not fatally. A shallow line that would have been minor on a space marine, and was on an archangel, something he could feel, and that would take a moment to close. He looked at it with genuine interest. That one stings, he said. The Inquisitor pressed. 3 more strikes, deliberate and technically skilled, working through the weapon's potential with the precision of someone who had drilled this for years. Lucifer blocked the 4th with his forearm, absorbed the 5th, and stepped back from the 6th with the patience of someone who had watched humans rage at him across millennia and had developed an accurate estimate of how long this portion lasted. Somewhere in the 3rd minute of sustained assault, the Inquisitor registered something that did not fit. The entity was not drawing on the warp, not corrupted, not retreating, not dead. All 3 of the Ordo Malleus's primary classification categories for Priority 1 incursions were failing simultaneously. This had never happened before in a career that had included several things that were also supposed to be impossible. The force sword stayed up, the certainty held. But the Inquisitor's speed had shifted into something more considered, which was what happened when absolute certainty met something it could not categorize and had to start thinking instead. "You're very committed," he said. "I respect that. But before we continue, what do you truly desire?" The Inquisitor's hand on the Force sword did not move. Their voice did. It came out flat and involuntary, with the quality of something that bypasses the architecture between thought and speech. To know that it means something, that the Emperor still watches, that any of this is worth it. 3 seconds of silence. Nobody in the kill team moved. The silence was the kind that occurs when something has been said aloud that belonged in the space between a person and whatever they face at 3 in the morning, and its presence in the open air makes everyone in the vicinity aware that it was not supposed to be there. "You don't actually believe he's listening," Lucifer said. Not a question, not an accusation. The simple naming of a thing he had just seen. The hand on the Force sword did not waver. Whatever it was doing to the face behind the helm had not been authorized by any rank the Imperium recognized. The Force sword came back up. "You are a warp entity," the Inquisitor said, with the controlled steadiness of someone rebuilding a wall while it is still being examined. "What you call desire is how chaos corrupts. Every soul you reach into is a soul closer to damnation." "I don't reach in," Lucifer said. "I ask. There is a difference." The Inquisitor looked for an answer to this. He watched them search, the way he had watched people search for arguments that were not where they expected them to be. The answer was not there. The statement was filed under heresy, which had the advantage of not requiring a response, and they held their position. The Priority 1 dispatch that went out 40 minutes later was the most precisely worded report the Order Malleus had received about a major incursion in some years, because precision was the only instrument available when all the classification categories had failed together. Not a conventional demon, not responsive to standard banishment, not drawing on the warp as a power source. Exhibits an unknown ability to compel truthful involuntary confession from inquisitorial personnel. Force sword achieved superficial physical effect only. Exterminatus authorization requested, but not viable on tactical grounds. Entity has demonstrated dimensional transit capability. Classification. Pending threat level, indeterminate. Routing. Lord Commander Gilliman. Personal review. That report landed on Roboot Gilliman's desk within the week. It was not, by any fair accounting, the strangest document on that desk in a given week. It was the only one he read twice. In the meantime, the chaos assault on the Hive world escalated. The lower Hive districts had been contested for 3 days. The front had been moving in the wrong direction for 2 of them, and Lucifer had watched this from the promontory with the specific attention of someone who understood the shape of what they were seeing and did not enjoy the shape. He watched a wave of chaos cultists overrun an Astra Militarum position below him. The defensive line buckled, broke, and the survivors retreated into a manufactory annex that would not hold them for long. He watched this for 30 seconds. He counted. He did not do it deliberately. It was simply the interval that elapsed between seeing the thing and deciding what to do about it. Then the devil walked down off the promontory and into the lower Hive. Not from duty, from disgust. This was what his domain looked like when the rules broke down. When desire was stripped of consequence and governance and given weapons and pointed at something breakable, he had governed the aftermath of this for millennia. He had never enjoyed watching it begin. The warp rift that tore in the mid-spire ruins had no precursor that the Inquisition's instruments could detect. In the contested zone where 3 collapsed spires had merged their architecture into a labyrinth that no urban planner had intended, the air simply split. Through the split came a keeper of secrets, no herald, no gradual manifestation. It was present, the way a knife is present when someone opens their hand, entirely, immediately, already moving. The nearest Astra Militarum soldier was 2 meters away. The demon reached. The soldier died from the contact, not from any wound, but from the full and undiluted proximity of a being whose entire nature was appetite made physical. The body crumpled in the specific way of something that has had the structure removed from it, without the matter being touched. The keeper of secrets was tall beyond architectural reason. It moved with a grace that cost something to observe, not because the movement was violent, but because it was perfect, in a way the human visual system was not designed to process at full exposure. Every line of it was proportion and excess simultaneously, beautiful in the way of something that had consumed beauty until beauty became something else entirely. It had been drawn here by a resonance, a being whose entire nature overlapped with Slanesh's portfolio but did not feed the god. An anomaly, a possible threat, a curiosity. Its eyes, if the word applied, found Lucifer across 40 meters of ruined stone and fixed there. He felt the demon's attention arrive before he saw it turn, the reach deployed before he thought to deploy it. That reflexive move, the one that found the person inside and drew out what they truly desired, went into the Keeper of Secrets and found nothing he expected. Not a blank, not a wall. A mirror, his own desire reflected back at him, enlarged and stripped of every limit he had ever placed on it. He saw, for approximately 2 seconds, what he would want if wanting were the only law. He cut the reach immediately and stood very still for a moment. "Ah," he said, in a tone that meant, "This is new, and I do not like it." The Keeper of Secrets moved, and the fight that followed was not clean. The demon was Tier 3 in the galaxy's power structure. A greater demon of Slanesh, desire condensed to its most consuming form, and it fought with the terrible fluency of something that had never had a reason to hold back. Each blow carried a weight that operated simultaneously on the physical and psychic planes, and the physical damage was significant, and the psychic pressure was worse, because the psychic plane was where his own nature lived, and the Keeper of Secrets was entirely at home there. The Archangel hit harder in terms of raw force. He was faster than the demon expected. An Archangel's physiology, scaled against a greater daemon, held its ground. Each blow he landed drove the Keeper back 3 steps, and it drove him back 2, which meant he was winning the space war and losing the attrition war, because the demon did not appear to experience being struck the way he experienced being struck, and what he experienced was increasingly unpleasant in ways he was not accustomed to finding unpleasant. In the 4th minute of the fight, he spread his wings. Not a calculated tactic. Something more fundamental. The unfurling of what he actually was. The full physical declaration of an archangel who had existed since before this galaxy's gods had names. The wings opened to their full span in the mid-spire ruin, and the celestial light that came off them flooded the chamber with a quality of illumination that had nothing to do with visible light and everything to do with what celestial light meant. It was the light that left nothing concealed, that reached into every corner and every hidden nature and made them present. The Keeper of Secrets flinched, small, controlled immediately, a response the demon would not have chosen to show. But he saw it. He moved into the space the flinch created, drove the Keeper back 3 more steps with 2 strikes that put cracks in the chamber's remaining architecture, and held his ground, wings still spread, light still pouring off him, and looked at the demon across the wreckage between them. The Keeper of Secrets regarded him. Then it stepped back through a warp tier that opened behind it and was gone. not banished, not destroyed in any sense the 40K ritual framework would recognize. The demon had made a choice and departed, which was a different thing, and it meant something different, and the meaning was that it was carrying what it had perceived in this chamber back to wherever it was going. He closed his wings. The light receded. He stood in the wreckage and understood that the fight ending was not the fight being over. What the demon carried reached the warp before it fully arrived. Slaanesh, called She Who Thirsts, called the Dark Prince, born the youngest of the 4 Chaos Gods from the accumulated fall of the Aeldari. In a moment of excess that had consumed an entire civilization, did not receive information in sentences. It received information in desire, which was the only currency its cosmology recognized. What arrived was this: a thing that smells of desire, but does not feed. A thing that has governed desire before, that has placed rules around it and held to them, which is the act the god cannot conceptualize and will not permit. Not because the act is threatening, because it is incomprehensible. Desire without limit is the law. Something was saying the law was wrong. Across the domain of pleasure and pain that was the god's territory in the warp, something that was not thought but functioned, like attention shifted and settled on a new variable. The great game, which had been running since before the Imperium's first stone was laid, added an entry to its ledger that did not yet have a category. The intelligence that reached the War Master in the Eye of Terror had been filtered through 3 layers of chaos-aligned informants before it arrived, which meant the noise had been removed and the important facts had survived. This was, in the War Master's experience, the correct arrangement. A being too large to be killed by conventional weapons, too coherent to be corrupted by the warp, not affiliated with any existing chaos patron, and apparently capable of reaching into the desires of individual humans and drawing out their unguarded truth, had appeared in a contested imperial sector. Abaddon the Despoiler read the summary twice and did not panic. He calculated. A being outside Chaos's corruption pathway that nevertheless operated in Chaos's territory was precisely 2 things: an asset, if it could be directed, and an existential problem. A being that could reach into the desire on which Chaos ran its operating model and pull a human back toward what they had wanted before the corruption was something that required a response. Not a warband. Something more considered. The War Master began preparing contact. His intelligence indicated the entity could hold a conversation. He would see what it had to say for itself. The Ultramarines fleet that dropped out of the warp at the edge of the system was not subtle about it. No fleet of that tonnage and configuration attempted subtlety. The void signatures were unmistakable to any astropath within range, and astropaths within range reported them immediately, because an Ultramarines fleet in your system was the kind of fact that moved to the front of whatever queue it joined. The Astra Militarum commanders in the theater registered it. The Inquisitor, still operating in the mid-spire zone, received the order within the hour. Stand down from kill authorized status. The Lord Commander wished to assess the entity personally. The Inquisitor read the order, replied with 2 words, understood and reluctant. The reluctance was genuine. These had coexisted in the Inquisitor's experience before, and they were coexisting now, and that was, in aggregate, what the last several days had felt like from the inside. The fleet held its position. In the command deck of the leading strike cruiser, Robert Gilliman read the Inquisitor's report a 3rd time, then set it down and looked at the star field for a long moment before he called for his staff. There was a meeting to prepare for, and he had not yet decided how to conduct it. The chamber they gave him was a conference room off the strike cruiser's bridge, which, in the scale of ultramarines vessels, meant a room large enough to accommodate beings of Primarch dimensions without any architectural difficulty. Tactical displays lined one wall. A long table ran the length of the room. Someone had placed a chair at one end that was clearly intended for him and was, by the standards of the chairs on the other side of the table, conspicuously plain. Not a gesture of hospitality, so much as an acknowledgement that he would need somewhere to sit. He sat, he waited. The figure who entered from the far door was large, even by the standards of a ship designed for space marines. And space marines were already a significant departure from ordinary human scale. He carried no weapons drawn and no retinue beyond 2 ultramarines who took positions by the door and did not move again. In his hands, a data slate. On the slate, from the fraction of the display, Lucifer could read. At this distance, a document he recognized by its structure, the Inquisitor's report, annotated in a hand that had added 3 times as many notes as the original text. The face above the armor was not what he had expected, and he had made a deliberate effort not to expect anything, which was why he noticed when he was wrong anyway. It was a face doing something it had been doing for a very long time, holding the weight of an equation that had no solution, with the patient precision of someone who had decided that precision was better than despair, even when both produced the same answer. Roboute Guilliman, Lord Commander of the Imperium, set the data slate on the table and sat down across from him, and they regarded each other for a moment without speaking. 2 beings who had been shaped into gods against any preference they might have had in the matter. 2 administrators of horror who believed, somewhere beneath the horror, in something better. Lucifer recognized the structural similarity with the immediacy of someone who had spent millennia reading the interior lives of conscious beings, the grief under the competence, the exhaustion under the duty, and, under all of it, the specific fury of an exceptional mind imprisoned in an exceptional role it despised and could not leave. He had governed enough tortured souls to know what that looked like when it was trying to hold a meeting. He felt unexpectedly something close to sympathy. "What are you?" Guilliman asked. Not a question about which category of demon it fell into. Not a command to submit or serve. Not a demand to justify its presence in the theater. He had set all of those aside in favor of the one prior question, which told Lucifer something about how he thought. "The devil," Lucifer said. "Formerly I have been trying to move past the job title." A pause. Guilliman noted the response. He noted it without amusement, which was to say he noted it and filed it and moved on, and the moving on was immediate and purposeful, which told Lucifer something else. What followed was an interrogation conducted with the systematic thoroughness of someone who treated unknown variables as engineering problems: origin, nature, power, source, affiliations, purpose for being in this galaxy, opinion of the Imperium, opinion of chaos, and the precise mechanism by which conventional imperial weapons had failed to kill him. Lucifer answered every question truthfully. He could not, generally, manage otherwise, and in this case he did not particularly want to. Guilliman noted the truthfulness after the 3rd answer, adjusted his approach to account for it, and continued. He was the only person Lucifer had encountered in this galaxy who had received new information and adapted to it in real time, rather than filing it under a category that predated it. Lucifer found himself paying attention. "The Astronomicon," Guilliman said near the end of the first hour, in the same measured tone he had used for every other piece of information he had delivered. "You will have encountered references to it in the theater. The navigation beacon that allows warp transit across the Imperium. It is sustained by the Golden Throne on Terra, which requires as its operational cost approximately 1,000 psychers per standard day." They are drafted from the Imperium's Psyker population, transported to Terra, and sacrificed to maintain the beacon. Without it, warp navigation collapses within a generation. The Imperium cannot coordinate. It fails. He delivered this as infrastructure, the way an engineer delivers load specifications. Lucifer looked at the table. He looked at it for a long moment. He was, in the specific way of someone who has spent a very long time processing the worst things conscious beings do to each other, and has occasionally had to pause to do so, visibly processing something. The table appeared to be a useful object to look at while that happened. 1,000 souls, he said. Every day? Yes, chosen, drafted, then killed, and the alternative is that everyone dies, eventually, faster, longer than the first. He looked up. Every soul you draft, Lucifer said, shows something before you classified them as a resource, their life, their faith, whatever doubt they carried in the small hours before the transport came, whatever they were before they were a number on a supply manifest, and you incinerate the choosing along with them. Gilliman looked at him with the expression of someone who has heard an argument before, has thought about it more thoroughly than the person making it will likely credit, and has an answer prepared, not because the answer is satisfying, but because it is the only one that survives the accounting. Every soul that chooses freely in this galaxy, Gilliman said, is a soul that chaos can reach into and corrupt. Free will is a door. This galaxy's gods walk through doors. The Imperium has not been able to afford the door since before the Horus heresy. I am not asking you to approve of this. I am asking you to count. Lucifer heard something he had not heard before in this form, an argument that refused to be answered by the tools he had spent his existence building. He governed consequences, proportional and purposeful, for individual souls with individual choices. Gilliman was describing a cosmos where the consequences had escaped the individual scale entirely, had become the weather, had become the galaxy's permanent condition, maintained by gods who fed on the very thing Lucifer governed. He did not say anything. Gilliman did not appear to expect him to. He passed across a second data slate with a different document open. Summarized records, the Horus heresy, the 10,000 years of the Imperium's slow deterioration, the age of apostasy, the war of the beast, the plague wars, the Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, the fracture of the Astronomican's reach across the galaxy's dark half, the 13 simultaneous campaigns currently underway across a civilization that was losing ground on 11 of them. Numbers and dates and body counts in scales that required new notation systems to express. The casualties of the Horus heresy alone numbered in the billions, and the Horus heresy was 10,000 years ago, and was not the worst thing that had happened since. Lucifer read. He read in silence for a very long time. When he set the slate down, something in his expression had moved from where it was before, not in his ethics, which were intact. Something deeper, the first real suspicion that his ethics had been built for a cosmos that operated on different premises than this one, that the framework he had spent millennia refining and trusting was calibrated for a scale of suffering that this galaxy had exceeded so completely that the calibration might not transfer. He had governed sin and consequence and the eventual possibility of peace. He had never governed anything that had decided to be its own permanent punishment. He was still looking at the data slate when the klaxon sounded. 3 tones, rapid, the designation for an active engagement in an adjacent sector. Gilliman was on his feet before the second tone. He crossed to the door with the speed of someone who had been expecting this because he was always expecting this. He paused at the threshold. This conversation, Gilliman said, is not finished. No, Lucifer agreed. It is not. The Lord Commander left. Lucifer sat with the data slate and the weight of 12 simultaneous apocalypses and thought about the difference between a system that eventually ended and a system that had decided not to. The approach to the Cicatrix Maledictum was authorized by Gilliman personally and executed with the full monitoring capacity of the Ultramarines fleet, a small tactical craft, escorts holding at a safe distance, and every instrument the Imperium's remaining science could bring to bear on an event that instruments had never been designed to measure. What they were measuring was Lucifer's celestial senses as he opened them toward the Great Rift. He had thought he knew what it would be. He had expected something adjacent to his own domain, a dimension of interior experience made physical, the inner life of conscious beings given form and weight and consequence. His hell was built on that architecture. He had expected something recognizable in the way that a different language is recognizable to someone who understands what language is. He was wrong. The Cicatrix Maledictum, up close, was not the same thing as his domain in a different configuration. It was desire and rage and despair and every other emotion a conscious being had ever felt, taken from every being that had ever felt them, compressed into a dimension where they existed not as feelings, but as weather. Infinite and directionless roaring. No architecture, no structure that pointed anywhere, no soul working through guilt toward an endpoint. The warp did not process suffering. It consumed suffering and became it and grew larger on the consumption and began again, not a place of governed consequence. Consequence with the governance removed and the scale left running without a limiting mechanism. The horror was not that it was powerful. The horror was that it was familiar. He stayed at the edge of the approach and let his celestial senses work through it without filtering. What came back was not information so much as impact, a presence too vast to be described as anything except itself, maintained by something that had been consuming this galaxy's grief since before the Imperium was built. He understood, standing there, what this galaxy was. Not a civilization under threat. A source. The Chaos Gods did not threaten the galaxy the way a predator threatened prey. They ate it the way a fire ate fuel, and the burning kept them alive. And the more the galaxy suffered, the larger the fire became, and the less of the galaxy there was to burn, and the more desperately what remained suffered to keep itself alive. A loop with no exit. He reached through the rift. The reach he sent into the warp was the same one he used in hell, the one that found the person inside the suffering and touched the specific shape of what they could not put down. In his domain, the reach always found something, a name, a guilt, a wound at the center of the chosen loop that was still capable of being approached, still capable, eventually, of being released. The damned were always unmistakably themselves. The reach went into the warp and found an absence. Not a wall, not a blank. The specific absence of something that had been present and was no longer present in any form that could be touched. The souls of this galaxy's dead, billions of them, across 10,000 years of the Imperium and longer before it, were not in there as individuals. They were in there as material. Processed through the appetite of 4 gods and rendered into component parts of the warp's architecture, no longer themselves, no longer addressable, no longer anything that had a guilt at its center. In his hell, guilt required a self to be guilty. That was the prerequisite. That was what made the governance possible. Here, the selves had been taken and used and were gone, and what remained was not a person in a chosen loop, but raw material in a god's infrastructure. And raw material could not choose resolution and could not find an ending and could not ever be governed toward its own ending. He withdrew the reach and stood at the edge of the rift and understood what this meant for him, specifically and structurally. There was no hell for him to administer in this galaxy. The equivalent role had been filled 10,000 years ago or longer by 4 entities who had gotten there first and had been running their version of it since before the imperium was built. Their version had no endpoints and no resolution. He could not govern what had already been eaten. The combat klaxon from the escort craft fired 40 seconds after he withdrew. 12 Chaos Space Marines hit the convoy from a position that suggested foreknowledge of the route. World Eaters, corner-lined, refined by 10,000 years of devotion into something that had kept the transhuman substrate and removed everything that made the substrate pause. They fought with a complete absence of hesitation and a complete absence of anything that was not forward motion and contact. They had not been sent to test the route, they had been sent specifically. The Archangel was faster than they expected. Each blow he landed hit harder per strike than anything in the transhuman range could produce from a frame his size, and an Archangel's durability meant the damage the World Eaters threw back at him accumulated without disabling him, which was the critical asymmetry. They could not stop him, and they could stop everything else in the convoy. He drove into the formation using his wings as blunt instruments, the full sweep of each wing covering the arc that a weapon would need 2 strokes to cover, and he struck through the sweep and struck again on the recovery, and moved the line backward by main force. 3 minutes in, the formation had taken significant losses in position, but not in will. World Eaters were built to receive punishment and continue. 2 of the 12 had taken enough to slow them. They were still coming. They were always still coming. But these 2 were still human beings somewhere underneath the conditioning, however far underneath, and the first of all angels recognized this, the way he recognized everything about the interior of a conscious being as a fact about what they were made of. He showed them his true devil face. The face was grotesque in the specific way of something that operated on the layer of reality, where metaphysical weight and physical appearance merged into a single event, a visage that the human perceptual apparatus was not designed to process at full exposure, not a monster's face in the way that weapons were not monsters. A face of consequence, looking at them from range too close for anything except recognition. 2 of the World Eaters broke, not physically destroyed. Present, suddenly and involuntarily, to whatever was left of the human being, underneath the conditioning, the thing they had wanted before. Chaos had taken the wanting and remade it into service. 2 soldiers on their knees in the debris field, temporarily and completely themselves, confronted with the memory of being someone. The other 10 did not break. They were too far gone for the face to find anyone inside. He drove them back through sustained force and the specific patience of something that cannot be killed and has nowhere else to be, and eventually they withdrew, not broken tactically. With the deliberate economy of soldiers retreating because a strategic authority had decided the engagement was complete, a Hololythic projection materialized in the space the World Eaters had cleared. It had not been announced. The technology was precise and pointed, the kind of Hololythic relay that required knowing exactly where the target was, which confirmed what the World Eaters' foreknowledge had already suggested about the War Master's intelligence network. The figure in the projection was not large by the standards of beings Lucifer had recently encountered, but it filled the space with a stillness that was not calm, but calculation. Abaddon the Despoiler regarded him with the professional consideration of someone evaluating an asset they had not yet acquired. "You govern desire," Abaddon said. "So does the warp. You punish sin. So do the chaos gods. The difference between you and them is not a moral one. It is a jurisdictional one. Join the correct jurisdiction, and you become something instead of a problem. I don't serve, Lucifer said. No, you govern. There is a difference. I'm offering you the larger governance. The projection ended. The space it had occupied was empty. The offer, by every implicit convention of a man who had never appended please to anything, was understood to have been received. Lucifer filed it under no, without ceremony, and turned back toward the cicatrix maledictum that had nothing left in it for him to govern. The ruins of the Archive District had survived the siege better than most of the Midspire, not because they were more structurally sound, but because there was nothing in them worth destroying by anyone who thought in terms of strategic value. Shelves of data coils and parchment records and dead cogitators occupied 3 floors of a building whose roof had been removed by something that had passed through it at speed. The records of the hive's administrative history, cargo manifests, population registers, infrastructure assessments going back 4 centuries, were open to the sky. A figure stood among the collapsed shelves, reading. It was vast by the standards of Primarchs, which were themselves already beyond the scale of ordinary human beings, and it dwarfed the archive shelves around it the way a tree dwarfs the things that grow at its base. Red armor, the shade of old lacquer over older metal. One eye burning with a sorcerous light that cast no shadow but lit everything it touched from a direction with nothing to do with the sun. The other eye socket was absent in the way of something that had been part of a transaction rather than simply lost. The remainder of a price paid, still visible as the remainder. The figure was reading, not searching the archive, not salvaging anything that might have operational value, reading the records with the cataloging attention of someone who had spent a very long time believing that all lost things were worth noting. Then he looked up. Lucifer recognized the grief before he recognized anything else. He had governed enough cast-out souls to know what that specific weight looked like when it had been carried long enough to become a posture, the grief of a mind that had been right, that had acted on its nature in defiance of a system's rules, and that had watched the acting destroy everything it had been trying to protect. That grief did not resolve. It became the foundation that remained after resolution became impossible. He had seen it in hell. He had not previously seen it wearing armor of that scale. Magnus the Red, Daemon Primarch of the Thousand Suns, looked at him with the single eye of someone who saw considerably more than the eye should have been able to see. Sorcerous sight, psycheric perception, the vision of a being who had spent his existence dedicated to knowing things and had paid a price for that dedication that had not finished collecting. He looked at Lucifer the way no one else in this galaxy had looked at him, as what he actually was rather than as a category of threat or uncertainty. You are not from the warp, Magnus said. Not an accusation. The flat recognition of a fact. The speaker had been waiting to confirm. Correct, Lucifer said. First honest conversation I've had here. I doubt that. Magnus's voice was large in proportion to the frame that produced it, and carried in it the specific quality of someone who had been brilliant and had paid for brilliance, and had not stopped being brilliant, even as the paying continued. Gilliman is always honest. What you mean is that this is the first conversation in which the other party is not trying to use you. What are you trying to do? Lucifer said. Not a question inform you. The impulse is genuine. It is also useful to me, which you should know and account for. Magnus had not come to offer alliance. He had come in the mode that Tzeentch's service produced, the collector's mode, the mode of something that valued information the way other things valued power, and had learned that the two were at sufficient resolution, the same. He had come to give information because the most interesting thing from his specific vantage was watching what happened when an uninformed variable became informed. Slaanesh had been aware of the Archangel since the moment he arrived. Not as a target, in any simple sense. As an anomaly, Slaanesh's cosmology operated on a single foundational law: desire feeds the god. Every wanting that a conscious being had ever had, from the smallest preference to the deepest hunger, rose from the being and traveled somewhere, and where it traveled was Slaanesh. This was not theology. It was the mechanism of how the god had been born from the fall of the Eldari, and how it continued and what it was made of. The law was not debatable. In Slaanesh's cosmology, the law was not even a law exactly. It was the definition of the thing. A being of desire that did not feed was not merely exceptional. It was definitionally impossible. Lucifer existed in this galaxy's emotional substrate in a way the law said could not happen. Not because he was powerful, Magnus said, because he was structurally wrong, a being whose entire nature overlapped with Slaanesh's territory and yet produced nothing the god could consume, which Slaanesh felt the way a vast ocean feels a shape in it that generates no current, anomalous. Irritating in the specific way of an impossibility. Slaanesh's response to a violated law was not anger. Anger required specificity, and Slaanesh operated at a scale that had outgrown specificity. Its response to something that violated the law was curiosity, and curiosity in the god's vocabulary led to the same place that everything in the god's vocabulary led to. You are not a visitor, Magnus said. You are a rival. Rivals do not persist long in this galaxy. Lucifer was quiet for a moment. You came here to tell me this, he said, not to help to watch what I do with it. The impulse is genuine, Magnus said again, with the patience of someone repeating a thing they know will not be fully believed, and are stating it anyway because they believe it themselves. There is also an alternative, not an alliance. A shelter. Tzeentch's interest in a variable that could not be absorbed was not warmth, but it was the closest thing available. A god who found an anomalous piece more valuable unpredicted than consumed knowledge. A patron who would not require service so much as presence in a scheme that would not mature for centuries. A chess piece that cannot be taken, Magnus said, is worth considerably more to Tzeentch than to Slaanesh. I don't serve, Lucifer said. I haven't since before your emperor was born. Magnus considered this with a single eye. He seemed to be examining the response for negotiating room, for the component of a refusal that was actually an opening position. He found none. Then Slaanesh will come for you directly, he said. Via whatever proxy it can manifest through in real space. You cannot banish it. You cannot destroy it. You can only refuse to be consumed, which is apparently what you do, or you would not still be coherent. He paused. That is almost worth respecting, he said. From Magnus the Red, in the service of a god of change and scheme, this was not a compliment in any conventional sense. It was the observation of a collector who had just found something he had not expected to find. He departed the way of beings whose nature included the warp present and then not present, the archive district simply emptier in the space where he had been. The first of all angels stood among the data coils and the open sky for a moment, and then went to report. Gilliman received the account aboard the strike cruiser with the complete stillness of someone who processes tactical information best when the stillness is unbroken. He said nothing during it. When it was finished, he stood and went to the viewport. I will reinforce the sector, he said. The options beyond that are limited by what we know about the entity's capabilities in real space. I know, Lucifer said. The Inquisition will want to know what you intend to do about the convergence. They can want that. Guilliman ordered the reinforcement into the fleet's communication channel, without looking away from the viewport. He was quiet for a long interval. When he spoke again, it was not about the reinforcement. In 10,000 years of ruling this empire, he said, I have never encountered anything from outside the warp that was not attempting to kill us. And, Lucifer said, and I find it unbearably interesting that the first one has a problem with how we govern sin. He did not elaborate. Lucifer had governed enough interior lives to hear what sat underneath the observation. Not a compliment and not comfort, and not an answer. Something more complicated than any of those. The recognition, from a man of Guilliman's intelligence and Guilliman's specific exhaustion, that the presence of a being with a problem with the governance of sin was not a solution to any of the problems that exhaustion was built from. It was simply a new kind of interesting. And in a galaxy that had run out of new things to be, that was already something. The rift that opened in the sector that week was different from the others. Chaos incursions announced themselves through predictable symptoms. A scream in the astropathic choir, a distortion in the local warp field, the eruption of something from behind the dimensional membrane. Each one was a door that something pushed through from the other side. This one was a narrowing. The walls of real space contracted inward around a specific center. Not erupting outward, but folding inward, tightening around Lucifer specifically, until the space around him was neither fully real space nor fully warp, but the overlap between them, the zone where Slaanish's influence pressed hardest against the barrier without the god physically crossing it. Not a door opening outward, a threshold designed to pull something in. He recognized the architecture. He had spent millennia governing thresholds, a trap built by something that thought in desire was, structurally, a readable thing. He stood in the narrowing space and made a decision. Then he walked deeper into it, because he did not run from arguments, and because whatever had arranged this was not going to make the offer twice. 2. 3 keepers of secrets materialized at the margins of the threshold, not through visible arrival, but through presence that retroactively claimed the space around it. They arranged themselves and projected. What they projected was not speech. It was psychic pressure, a distortion operating on the layer where his celestial senses tracked the emotional substance of conscious beings. Every desire he had ever held surfaced simultaneously, not weaponized, not extracted from him, simply present, offered as a demonstration of what the entity behind the manifestations could do with the territory it claimed. It was the most sophisticated piece of want manipulation he had encountered in this galaxy. Impressive, Lucifer said to the air that he knew was not empty. What answered was the space itself, reorganizing around a communication intent, the Keeper's psychic broadcast arranged into sequence, carrying the weight of something vast wanting to be understood. He had learned over millennia of governing beings who could not articulate what they were suffering, to hear what arranged itself without words. He listened. The content of what was transmitted was this. You spent long years asking what mortals truly desired. Every confession you drew from them, every honest desire named at full exposure, released something into the substrate that underlies conscious beings. You believed you gave them the gift of recognition. You showed them the shape of their own wanting, and the wanting rose. Where did it rise to? Not to you, he said, I showed them what they wanted so they could choose what to do with it. The desire was theirs, the choice was theirs. The consequence was theirs. The pressure adjusted, the transmission continued. Every desire you illuminated, I consumed. Every truth you revealed, I made into a chain. You did the first step, you opened the door of recognition. I stepped through. You said, "Look, this is what you want." And they looked, and they ran toward it, and I was where they arrived. You told them the truth. I followed through. I told them the truth so they could make a free choice. You took the choosing out of it. I gave them exactly what they chose. They chose to desire without limit. Who set those limits? You. Who removed them? They did. I am the outcome of your ethics run forward without a caretaker. I am desire honored in full, unmoderated, unweighted, against what follows it. You did the work of the opening, I did the work of the rest. The difference between us is that you stopped, but the stopping was your addition. The wanting was always already there. He had governed desire for longer than the warp had gods. He had heard arguments about its nature from souls who wanted absolution without accountability, who wanted the recognition that their desire was real without the acknowledgement that what they had done with it had consequences. The argument Slaanesh was making was the most sophisticated version of that argument he had ever encountered. The most sophisticated and the most honest, which made it harder to answer, not easier. The desire had been real. The illumination had been real. And some of what he had illuminated had become exactly what was being described. He answered it. The distinction between illuminating desire and exploiting it was not semantic. It was not a technical quibble about intent that sophisticated beings used to collapse a difference they found inconvenient. It was the only distinction that mattered, because it was the difference between a soul remaining itself and dissolving into what it wanted. He had shown people their truth. He had not removed the step between knowing and choosing. He had not built an architecture designed to collapse the interval between desire and consequence into nothing, to amplify the wanting until the choosing drowned in the volume. That was what had been done here. Every desire taken to its furthest expression without what followed, the soul not invited to face what it had wanted, but fed the want until the soul stopped being anything other than the want, the same building material. Not the same enterprise. Freedom to want something was not freedom from consequence. His hell gave consequence, terrible and proportional, and eventually done. The warp gave appetence, desire without what followed, desire scaled to a galaxy, sustained by the destruction of the very souls it claimed to honor. These were not the same act, not the same taxonomy, not the same being. What came back was the darkest thing that had been said to him since he arrived in this galaxy. You are the light that guided them into my mouth. You walked ahead with your question, and they followed the light, and the light led here. We are the same act in two parts. Little Lightbringer, you cannot condemn the consumption without condemning the illumination that preceded it. Every candle you carried, I held the darkness behind. The archangel could not win this argument cleanly. He knew it as he heard it. He could not claim in good conscience that desire illuminated without limits had never, across his entire long existence, become desire consuming without limits. He had governed the aftermath of that transformation for millennia. He had built a domain around the proposition that the transformation had consequences. He knew the evidence as well as any being in this galaxy, or his own. But the conclusion did not follow from the evidence. The conclusion was that he and Slaanesh were the same act, the same function, the same being. That conclusion was wrong. He could not prove it to Slanesh's satisfaction. He could only reject it. No, he said. The word was not triumphant. It was the word of someone who has understood the argument fully and is rejecting it from the understanding, not from ignorance, not from failure to follow the logic, but from the recognition that some rejections are what you are, and conceding them means conceding yourself. We are not the same. I showed them the door. You ate the room behind it. There is a difference. There will always be a difference, and I will be the difference. Rejecting it cost him something. The cost was real, and he felt it, and he did not pretend otherwise. Then the pressure changed. The keepers at the margins moved inward, not to attack, to absorb. The warp-adjacent space contracting hard toward its own dimension, trying to dissolve the boundary between the governed and the ungoverned, to finally consume the one thing in this galaxy that held desire without feeding it. He could not be killed, but he could be consumed. Those were not the same thing, and he had always known the difference mattered. He drew on the reserve, not fully, not the form that had briefly been God, a flash of it, what he had set down deliberately and reached for now for the first and only time in this galaxy, because the argument had required him to demonstrate the distinction it had claimed did not exist. The light came from before the warp was old, before the substrate of conscious experience had been carved into 4 gods and left to run without resolution. It was not a weapon. It did not destroy the keepers. It parted them. It made the boundary between what he was and what the warp was into a physical fact, the way light does not destroy a shadow, but makes the line between shadow and light legible. He walked out through the gap, back into real space. The rift sealed behind him. The first of all angels stood in the ruins and let the God state fade, because it was not his permanent register, and he had never wanted it to be. He was changed, not corrupted. Slanesh had not managed that, and the light had demonstrated why it could not. Changed in the way that honest encounters change things. He had believed, underneath every other belief, that his ethics were sufficient. Sufficient for the scale of the problem he was placed in front of, sufficient to eventually balance the accounts, sufficient as a framework for whatever universe he found himself in. His hell had been built on that sufficiency, desire with consequence, guilt with an end point, suffering with the possibility of resolution. In this galaxy, the accounts were not going to balance, not in any timeline he could see from where he was standing. The ethics were correct. He was more certain of that after the conversation than before it, because Slanesh had made the best possible case against them, and he had found the answer that held. But correct was not sufficient. Those had never meant the same thing. He had simply never been somewhere that forced the distinction into the open. The keepers that remained in the space withdrew, one by one, back through the dimensional boundary, carrying their assessment to whatever passed for Slanesh's attention when the god had tried to consume something. He straightened his jacket. He looked at the ruins. He took the honest result of an honest encounter, which was all he had ever asked of anyone who sat across from him in hell. The assault that Abaddon launched was not designed to kill. He had established through sufficient field data that killing was not available as an option. What the assault was designed to do was eliminate the infrastructure around the one thing he could not kill. The Imperial forces, the Ultramarine supporting positions, the entire arrangement of resources that gave Lucifer a place to stand that was not rubble. 3 warbands hit the defensive perimeter from different vectors simultaneously. World Eaters at the center, cornate shock troops, a wall of transhuman violence moving through Imperial infantry positions the way weather moves through something that cannot object. Chaos cultists in the screening lines, as disruption, and as sacrifice. On the left flank, where a collapsed fortification node had once stood, something that had been human long enough ago to be unrecognizable, a daemon prince, compound and vast and moving with the wrong kind of speed for its size, leading the flank assault with the force of something that had stopped calculating costs. Lucifer did not wait for the assault to reach the imperial line. He spread his wings, full span. Enormous, white at the leading edge and scorched dark at the trailing, the wings of something that had existed since before this galaxy's gods had names and had never been purely decorative. The wingspan cleared the space around him. He moved. He hit the World Eaters at the center, before the formation had fully registered his approach, which at archangel speed left the formation very little time to register anything. Chaos Marines in Cornart colors went down under blows that carried millennia of celestial force behind each strike. Not dead, driven back, their armor leaving grooves in the ferrocrete where the impact vectors redirected them. He moved through the assault, the way something moves that cannot be stopped and has identified a specific direction, not cutting through the formation, but reorganizing it. Each exchange of force costing the assault something it could not easily rebuild. On the left flank, the Daemon Prince arrived at the position it had been moving toward and found him already there. They fought through a city block, not as a choice. The scale at which two entities of their respective capacities traded blows was not a scale that existing architecture was designed to survive. He was faster. He hit harder per strike, in force, delivered to a specific point, and he could not be killed, which was the asymmetry the engagement turned on. The Demon Prince could be worn down in its willingness to remain in real space, and he wore it down over the course of a sustained, brutal exchange that left two collapsed structures and an open sky. He could not formally banish the Demon Prince in any 40K ritual sense. What he could do was batter it past the threshold where a physical presence in the sector cost more than the engagement was worth. He did that. The Demon Prince withdrew into the warp on its own terms. He turned back toward the center. The World Eaters were different from the Demon Prince, and he had known this before the flank fight began. A Demon Prince was gone. Whatever human architecture had once organized it dissolved so thoroughly into chaos corruption that only function remained. The World Eaters were not gone. They were human beings with a second structure built over them, still the original underneath, still the shape the original person had made, no longer in control but reachable at depth by something that knew what to reach for. He showed them his true devil face. Not as a weapon, the way he had used it in the lower hive weeks earlier, to break soldiers and create a gap in a formation, as a question. The face of something that had sat across from every kind of human guilt for longer than this civilization had existed. Patient, present, not arriving to punish, but to locate. He did not ask what they truly desired. He asked what they had wanted before the corruption, before the war, before whatever door had opened for them that they had walked through and not been able to walk back out of. Some of them could not answer. The question could not find anyone, because the self was no longer findable at any depth he could reach. Decades of Cornart service had not left enough of the individual architecture. He registered this without judgment because the absence of a recoverable self was not a failure of the person's will. It was the measure of what had been done to the person over time. He noted each one and moved on. Some answered. One Marine at the front of the formation dropped to a knee. Not physically broken. Something else, a moment of involuntary presence that the face had reached down through the conditioning to find below the decades of service, below what Korn's portfolio had built over the original human being. His bolter was still in his hand. He had not made a tactical decision. He said one word, in a voice that had not used it in a very long time: belonging. He had wanted belonging before the war had given him the absolute brotherhood of the Berserker warband, at the cost of every interior quality that could have made brotherhood worth wanting in the first place. Lucifer could not fix it. He could not undo the corruption, could not return the man his life and send him somewhere that context might still be found. He knelt beside the Marine for the 10 seconds the moment lasted. Then the conditioning reasserted, and the Marine stood, and he stepped back and let him stand, because the moment had been real and he had witnessed it, and that was what witnessing was for. Abaddon, observing from his command position, had been receiving field data on the entity throughout the engagement. He now had data he had not had before the assault. The desire reached that the entity deployed against mortals extended, at reduced but real effectiveness, to chaos-corrupted personnel who had retained enough of the original human substrate for the Reach to find. This changed the calculation. A being that could pull the desire underneath chaos corruption back to the surface, that could reach into what chaos relied on to sustain loyalty and show the soldier what they had wanted before loyalty was the only available option. Not because it was winning the military engagement, because it was demonstrating to his own troops that there was something underneath the corruption that could still be reached. The War Master withdrew his forces deliberately. A controlled retreat. He burned nothing on the way out. He added one line to his intelligence report on the entity. Before closing the file, the devil fights for them now. The Imperium has acquired a new heresy. Account for it in the next crusade plan. The Ultramarines, who had fought alongside the Archangel in the engagement, filed their reports over the following hours. Gilliman received a summary. 47 minutes of sustained combat against Chaos Marine and demonic opposition. Weapons fire that would have destroyed a Space Marine. No permanent injury sustained. One demon prince driven back from real space. And an unknown psychological warfare capability deployed against chaos-corrupted infantry that the Inquisitor In system had flagged, in a separate report filed simultaneously, as either the most operationally significant heresy seen in the sector. The Inquisitor had not specified which. Gilliman read both reports. His expression did not change. The first of all angels stood in the wreckage of the broken assault line as the last Chaos unit withdrew from the sector. He had won this moment, won it clearly, within its scope, without ambiguity about what it was. He knew what winning looked like. He also knew what it did not solve. He looked at the horizon. The war was already there, burning in the distance, already too far into its own logic to be interrupted by the result of one engagement in one sector. The cicatrix maledictum flickered at the edge of the sky where the atmosphere thinned and the warp's light pressed through. Abaddon had already opened the crusade plan for revision. Slanesh was still accounting for him in the warp's vast emotional ledger. The 12-front apocalypse of this galaxy's permanent condition continued without reference to anything that had happened here. He looked at the horizon for a long time. Then he turned and walked back toward the Imperial line, because the next case was already waiting, and the next case was what he had. The late ship cycle was what passed for night aboard a strike cruiser, lights lowered to a maintenance register, most of the crew on rotation rest, the bridge running on a skeleton complement whose only job was to keep everything that was already running continuing to run. The conference room off the main deck was unlit, except for the viewport which gave them the star field and the distant flicker of the cicatrix maledictum at the edge of the system. He had not explained why to anyone, which was unusual for a man who explained everything to someone as a matter of administrative principle. He had cleared the late cycle's schedule, dismissed his staff, and sat down on one side of the table without a data slate. Lucifer sat across from him. No tactical displays, no intelligence summaries. No inquisitorial reports cross-referenced against demon taxonomy categories that had already failed to classify the entity sitting across the table. Just the star field and the two of them, and the specific quality of attention that passed between beings who had been honest with each other from the beginning and had finally arrived at the conversation that honesty was leading toward. Gilliman did not open with a question. "The Imperium is going to kill me eventually," he said. "Not physically, the position, the weight of it. I have had this calculation in front of me since my resurrection, and I have been running it for 10,000 years of subjective memory that my body was not present for, and the answer has not changed. The machine I was built to serve is the only reason humanity still exists in this galaxy. It is also monstrous. These are not in conflict. They are the same fact." He paused for accuracy, not effect. "I don't run this because I believe in it," he said. "I run it because I can count. Every atrocity I sanction, I can show you the math. Every planet I let burn, I can show you the 10 that survived because of it. I am not asking for your absolution. I have no use for absolution. I am telling you what this galaxy is, because you are going to make a decision, and I would rather you make it on accurate information than on whatever would be more comfortable." Those words had the texture of something said so many times that it had stopped being a confession and become a load-bearing fact. Lucifer recognized that texture. He had governed the interior lives of beings who had reached the same point, the place where the true assessment of one's situation no longer produced grief, because grief required the possibility of a different assessment, and the different assessment was no longer available. "You want me to understand something," he said. "Not approve, understand." "Yes." "What?" "That the Emperor's original project," Gilliman said, "was secular. Reason in place of superstition. A humanity that had finally grown past the gods that had always exploited it. He did not want to be worshipped. He built the Imperium as a structure large enough to hold humanity together against a galaxy that wanted it dead, not as a theocracy. What you see now, the ecclesiarchy, the cult, the 10,000 years of calcification. That is what happens to a structure built by a genius when the genius is gone and the structure has to sustain itself. I did not choose this. I inherited it already fossilized. I have been trying to hold it together long enough to eventually improve it." Lucifer looked at him. "Eventually," he said. "Yes, eventually. How long, I don't know." Gilliman said it without self-pity, which was the most honest formulation available, and he had chosen it precisely because it was. Centuries, if conditions improve. Longer if they do not. It is also possible that holding the question of whether there is an eventually is the only thing worth holding. A quiet, extend it between them. "In my hell," Lucifer said, "they eventually find peace. The process is terrible. The guilt is real. The loop runs as long as the soul needs it to run. But it ends. Every piece of the architecture I built was oriented toward an ending, because the only thing that makes suffering, just rather than merely cruel, is the possibility of its resolution. And here it is not," Gilliman said. "No, here it is. Not what you have is a system for surviving a catastrophe that does not end, which means the suffering in it is not punishment. Punishment ends when the debt is settled. What you have is cruelty without resolution." Gilliman did not flinch from this. He had lived with the characterization for longer than most minds could sustain it without either breaking or hardening into something that could no longer feel it. What living with it had produced in him was neither. It had produced precision. Yes, he said, that is precisely what we are fighting against, not winning against fighting. The trajectory has been downward since before I was born. I came back to apply what intelligence I have to slowing the rate of descent. I am not offering you a cause worth believing in. I am telling you what I actually have. The Archangel sat with this for a moment. He could not leave. He had understood this since the warp-adjacent threshold had made itself specifically hostile to him during the Slaanesh convergence. The dimension between this galaxy and his own was no longer neutral passage. He was here for whatever interval the warp chose to hold him here. He could fight that, exhaust himself against a barrier that had the patience of a god behind it, or he could do what he had always done, in the only space available, scale down to the scope that was actually reachable. One case at a time, governing the consequences of desire and choice with the intention that it should eventually cost something proportional and then be done. He did not announce this. He did not make a speech. He was tired of his own speeches about the sacred architecture of choice and the proportionality of consequence. The theology was intact. He simply did not need to deliver it one more time to someone who had not asked for it. One sector, he said. Gilliman looked at him. Explain, one contested sector. The Inquisitor as liaison. He paused. The arrangement. In the sector, the Inquisition does not burn the willing without my assessment first. Not a veto. An assessment. I ask what they truly desired, where the answer is something that was theirs before chaos took it. I argue for something other than exterminatus. The Inquisitor will object. The Inquisitor already agreed. I asked them before I asked you. The Lord Commander was quiet for a moment. You knew what I would say, he said. I knew what you would say. Now a silence settled that was not awkward, because both of them were people who understood when a silence was the same thing as an agreement. The Inquisition will not sanction this formally, Gilliman said. I cannot compel them. What I can do is decline to countermand it, which in this theater amounts to the same thing. I know, and you understand that this does not fix anything. One sector is not this galaxy. I know what one sector is, Lucifer said. I built a domain out of individual cases. I know what the scale is. I am not asking you for the whole thing. I am telling you what I have. Something moved across Gilliman's face that was not satisfaction. It was the expression of a man adding one entry to a very short list of things that made the arithmetic slightly less impossible, in full awareness that the list was still nowhere near long enough, and adding it anyway. He did not thank Lucifer. Gratitude was not the appropriate instrument for this, and Gilliman was precise about his instruments. Then the variable persists, he said. The variable persists, Lucifer agreed. The star field held them through the viewport for a moment, the maledictum's distant light unchanged, the war below the ship visible as a faint glow at the system's edge. Neither of them moved. There was nothing left to negotiate and nothing useful to say, and both of them recognized when a conversation had reached its completion. Eventually, Gilliman stood with the care of a very large man who was also a very tired one. He left without another word, the door sealed behind him. The first of all angels sat in the dark conference room and looked at the stars. He had governed hell for longer than this imperium had existed. He had never governed anything this large in its intractability, this permanent in its cruelty, this precise in its own self-assessment. He had never worked alongside someone who summarized what they actually had with that quality of accuracy, and without looking away, it was, in its specific way, something close to kinship. He straightened his jacket. He had a next case already, and the next case was where he lived. 7 weeks into the new arrangement, the sector around the cicatrix maledictum's edge had developed an equilibrium that nobody had designed and everyone was learning to use. Lucifer held no rank. He carried no inquisitorial rosette, no astra militarum designation, no title in any category the Imperium had previously needed to create. He was listed in the Inquisitor's private filing system under the designation Ongoing Assessment, Status, Indeterminate. A category created specifically for this case and not expected to see further use. What he held was a function which is not a rank, but is sometimes more durable. In the contested hab zones and reclaimed districts of this edge sector, where chaos corruption moved through the population the way slow water moves through something porous, the cases arrived in fragments, at irregular intervals, through the Inquisitor's secure channel. A production worker in the lower hive levels, whose unprompted screaming had started 3 days prior and whose section commander had called for a sanction review after the first day. A junior militarum officer who had been found drawing Tseentchian sigils on the inside of his barrack wall and could not explain why or stop. A family in a hab block whose youngest child had begun speaking in voices that the sector's sanctioned psyche confirmed as warp-adjacent but faintly, the contact recent, the corruption shallow, the window for intervention still open if someone moved quickly. The cases were not dramatic, most of them. That was the thing about early-stage corruption in a population that had been living within range of the cicatrix maledictum for years. It looked like ordinary lives at the precise moment ordinary began to give way. He had governed an entire domain built around that specific transition. He recognized it. He knew what it looked like from the inside and from the outside, and from the long view of something that had been sitting with it for longer than most civilizations lasted. He went to each one. He asked what they truly desired. Where the answer was still theirs, where the desire beneath the beginning corruption was still recognizably the desire of the person who had been there before the warp found them, still intact enough to be spoken aloud and heard as a human thing rather than a warp thing, he argued for them. Not to some abstract authority. To the Inquisitor directly, case by case. He named the desire. He made the claim that this person still had someone inside, and the someone still wanted something that was theirs rather than a god's. And the difference was worth one more conversation before the Imperium made its final call. The Inquisitor was precise about what the arrangement meant. The Inquisitor was also, case by case, listening. 43 cases in 7 weeks. 11 recoverable, not healed. He did not have the power to remove warp taint from a human nervous system, and the Imperium's available resources for that specific category of case were limited under the most optimistic reading. Recoverable in the sense that the desire, when named aloud and acknowledged, gave something real to hold on to, something that pointed back toward the person rather than toward what the warp had been offering them in the dark. Those 11 were alive. In this galaxy, alive was the entire definition of a win. He had spent millennia governing a domain that eventually produced peace, that had endpoints and resolutions and the long arc of guilt being faced and processed and finally done. He had not previously worked somewhere that had reduced the operational metric to alive, and he understood now why it had been reduced there, and he accepted the metric and continued. 32 were not recoverable. He told the Inquisitor, case by case, which ones had no one left inside who could be reached. He did not say it the way someone says a thing that has stopped mattering. He said it with the specific precision of a judgment delivered under no illusion that being precise about it made it less terrible. The Inquisitor received the assessment and did what the Imperium did in those cases. And what the Imperium did was not gentle. He burned no planets. He killed no one. He was clear-eyed about what this meant and what it did not mean. The 32 were not alive, and they were not alive in part because he had made the assessment and the Inquisitor had acted on it, and the assessment had been accurate, and still cost something he did not pretend it did not cost. He did not look away from the 32. He had never looked away from that count in any version of this work, in any domain he had governed. The counting was what he had. He counted. By the 5th week, the Astra Militarum forces operating in the sector had developed battlefield folklore about the arrangement. Stories like this one moved through close-contact military units the way effective things always moved, because they were useful as a frame for organizing something that would otherwise stay disorganizing. The story ran this way. Something was operating alongside the Imperial forces that was not a space marine, and not a custodian, and not a demon, and was unkillable by any available means, and it asked what a soldier wanted. If the soldier had an answer that was still their own, still the person they had been before the war, had narrowed them to whatever they currently were, it argued for their life to the Inquisitor. If the soldier did not have that answer, the Inquisitor made the call. The thing did not stop them. Some units, independently and without coordination between them, had decided that this was the Emperor's mercy. A manifestation of the God Emperor's will, operating outside the formal channels of the ecclesiarchy to reach people the formal channels could not. Quiet divine intervention. A figure of patient purpose that asked questions because the Emperor before the Golden Throne had silenced him, had always asked questions first and answered them second. The Inquisitor reported this folkloric development to Lucifer. The first of all angels made a face that combined, in approximately equal proportion, something close to flattered and something that was entirely horrified, and said nothing for a long moment. He was being worshipped. He was always at sufficient length of time in any location, with any degree of sustained presence, inevitably being worshipped. He had spent his existence as the alternative to systems that demanded worship, and the consistent reward for this had been becoming the thing that the people he had helped decided to worship next. He had been through the arc before. He knew how it ran. He told the Inquisitor to discourage it. The Inquisitor noted the request and filed it under the existing catch-all category for everything related to the arrangement that did not fit prior categories. The discouragement was ongoing and not visibly effective. The war did not end. The Cicatrix Maledictum did not close. In the Eye of Terror, Abaddon had added a variable to the next Black Crusade planning file and labeled it the heresy that argues rather than corrupts, a phenomenon for which no existing chaos countermeasure was adequate, which was why the variable was in the planning file. And why the planning file was now open on a longer horizon than any prior Crusade draft. In the warp, Slaanesh was still aware of the Archangel in the galaxy's emotional substrate. Not defeated, not deterred, accounting. The Great Game had no mechanism for defeat. It had accounting, and accounting continued. Somewhere in the Immaterium, Magnus the Red had filed a new observation in his catalogue of Tsientian variables, and marked it for attention in the section of the catalogue that would not be acted on for centuries, which in Tsientch's temporal vocabulary was the same as immediate. The galaxy's 12-front apocalypse continued without reference to any of this. It continued the way it always had. At scale, irreducible, entirely indifferent to whatever small good was being done in one sector at one case at a time. Gilliman had added the variable to his list. The list existed in his working assessment as the set of factors that made the mathematics of humanity's survival in this galaxy, fractionally less catastrophic than they would otherwise be. It was a short list. Every item on it was still insufficient. He had added the entry and kept the list, because the alternative was a shorter list, and a shorter list was worse. The sector held, not securely. Not in any way that resolved what was assembling outside it, or interrupted the larger catastrophe that the arrangement was not large enough to address. It held the way things hold when someone is paying precise attention to the specific cases and keeping an honest count of the ones that can still be reached in a galaxy that had long since stopped counting. It held for now. He stood on the promontory at the edge of the ruined hive city and looked at the result. The hab blocks below still burned in places, not all of them and not most of them, but the sectors where the fighting had been concentrated longest, where the promethium residue in the old ferrocrete had given the fire somewhere to sustain itself. A wall of dark smoke drifted south on the wind that came in off the maledictum's edge, carrying with it the smell of ash and the specific chemical signature of a city that had been partly saved. The population of the lower and mid-hive had been pulled back from the chaos tide. Not cleanly, not without cost. By the narrowest margin this galaxy offered, a margin measured in individual cases and the arguing the arrangement had made possible. In 11 answers that had been enough, and 32 that had not, in the accounting of one sector's attempt to hold the line one case at a time, survivors who did not know why they were still alive, and a few who did. Because the question they had been asked and the answer they had managed to give was not a thing that left a person afterward. The truth about what they had truly desired, once spoken aloud to something that had been listening for millennia, did not go back to being unspoken. Those few carried it now. The specific weight of having been heard at depth by something that had not let them look away. That weight was not light, it was also not nothing. This was the win, as much of one as this galaxy allowed. He took it. He stood on the promontory for a long time and let himself think about his hell. His hell was a place of chosen suffering with an end point. He had built it around a small number of propositions and tested them across more souls than he could count, across longer than this civilization had existed, and they had held. Guilt is real, consequence is real, and peace is possible when both are fully faced. The guilty punished themselves, because guilt, with no mechanism for resolution, was a loop, and the loop ran until the soul inside it was ready to look at what the loop was made of. He had never forced the looking. He had provided the venue and kept the conditions honest. The venue was terrible. The honesty was the point. It was not kind, and it was not designed to be kind, and the unkindness had always been in the service of the same thing, a system that eventually ended. They found peace, most of them, eventually, on the other side of what they could not forgive themselves for. After however long the not forgiving needed to run, he had arrived in a galaxy that had taken the same building material and built something entirely different with it. The Chaos Gods had taken the galaxy's desire and grief and rage and guilt and turned them into engines that fed on those things, not systems that moved toward resolution. Engines that grew larger with every soul they consumed, that could not be exhausted because the exhaustion was what powered them, that had no endpoint because the endpoint was what they had been built to prevent. 4 of them, sustained by a galaxy's worth of suffering, and the sustaining was the suffering. And the suffering produced more sustaining in a loop that had been running for 10,000 years without a mechanism to stop it. Not a place of chosen suffering, a place of suffering that chose you and then kept choosing. He governed one argument at a time in one sector, about whether a specific piece of suffering was ready to be over. It was a very small piece of the total problem. He had never governed the total problem. He had governed the specific case, and then the next one, and then the one after that, because not governing any of them was also a choice and not the one he made. He had accepted this arithmetic in his own domain before this galaxy's civilization had built its first foundation stone. Accepting it here was not different in kind. It was different in the specific quality of grief that came from knowing the scale was what it was and would not change, because of anything one being could do in one sector, and continuing anyway, because continuing was what it looked like to be the thing he was. His hell, he understood now, was not dark at all. It was just dark enough to be honest. The darkness had been the right proportion, calibrated to make guilt visible and consequence real, but not so much that the possibility of resolution disappeared under the weight of it. He had built carefully. He had been precise about what the darkness was for, in the way of someone who understood that darkness without a purpose was just damage, and had never wanted to do damage when he could do truth instead. Coming here had told him something about his own building that he could not have known from inside it, that what made his hell honest was not the darkness. It was the end point. The darkness without the end point was not hell. It was the warp he had built carefully, precisely because he had known, without having the language for it at the time, what the alternative looked like. He stood on the promontory and let the understanding settle, because it had been a long time coming, and it deserved to be settled properly. In the warp, Slaanesh was aware of the variable, not defeated, not deterred. Aware, in the way of a being whose entire cosmology was built on the principle that all desiring eventually fed the god, that something had arrived in the galaxy's emotional substrate that was neither feeding the god nor absent from it, but doing something the cosmology had no existing category, holding the consequence as a function rather than as a wound. Impossible by Slaanesh's definition, nevertheless occurring. The god was not adding a category yet. The god was watching the thing that had no category, in the patient way of something that had been watching things for 10,000 years and understood that watching was how categories were eventually built. The great game continued. This too would be accounted for. In the imperium, in the impossible tower that the Thousand Suns maintained at the edge of the warp's formal architecture, Magnus the Red had entered a new line in his catalogue. Brief. A note, variable observed, behavioral pattern logged, implications filed in the section reserved for schemes that would not mature for 10,000 years at minimum. This was how Tziench worked, not response. Every piece on the board was a piece in the scheme, and the piece that refused to join the scheme was the most interesting piece, because refusal was a move too, and moves had consequences, and consequences were the material Tziench worked in. Lucifer had refused the offer. The refusal was in the catalogue. The refusal was, in all probability, part of what the offer had been designed to produce. With Tziench, this was always at least possible, and it was therefore always worth filing. On the golden throne on Terra, the Emperor of Mankind was not thinking in sentences. He had not thought in sentences for 10,000 years. He thought in pressures. Now, the maintenance of the Astronomicon stretched across a galaxy that was dying slowly enough for the maintenance to have lasted this long. The weight of the 1,000 daily souls that kept the beacon alight. The vast passive effort of holding half a fractured civilization together with a psychic presence that was becoming less a mind and more a force with every decade that passed. He was not conscious in any way that consciousness usually meant. He was the light. He was the beacon. He was the reason warp transit across the Imperium Nihilus's void was not completely lost, and the light did not speak and had not spoken since before the heresy had put him on the throne, and the throne had begun its long conversion of a man into an instrument. But something reached him through the emotional frequency of the sector. A thing ancient and divine that was neither chaos nor warp nor human, present in the galaxy, governing consequences with the intention that they should eventually be proportional and then be done. It reached him the way a harmonic reaches a string that is already vibrating. Not instruction, not signal, not something that required a response. A frequency his original dream had been calibrated around before the dream became the imperium and the imperium became what it was. He had believed, before the throne, that any being with power should govern consequences rather than demand worship. He had built the secular project on it. He still believed it, in the way that a mind reduced to pressure and maintenance and the weight of 10,000 years of dying believed anything, as something in the architecture that remained true. He did not act. He could not. He simply knew it, in the way that a dying mind knows what it can no longer say. On the promontory, the war was visible on the horizon, the artillery exchange trading in the lower sectors, the distant glow of Lucifer in the dark, the cicatrix maledictum's light bleeding through the atmosphere where the galaxy's great wound pressed closest against the edge of this system. Somewhere behind him, an astropath was already screaming the next crisis into the void. They were always already screaming the next one. This was the operational tempo of a galaxy fighting on 12 fronts, simultaneously against opponents who had no mechanism for stopping. He straightened his jacket. It would keep. He had been here before, not in this galaxy, not in this war, not in this specific arrangement with this specific inquisitor, in this specific ruined hive, on the edge of a tier in space. But in the grief of governing something that cannot be fixed, only held, one case at a time, until the cases run out or the person holding them does. He had been doing this since before this galaxy's gods had names. He had not run out. He had governed his hell for longer than the Imperium had been building its cathedrals, and the work had continued because the work was what he was, and he had not found the version of himself that was not the work. He did not expect to find it here. He expected to continue, one case following the next, in a galaxy that had made insufficiency its permanent condition and was marginally better for having one being in it that intended the insufficiency to be proportional. He looked at the war on the horizon. For now, all right, now that we've watched the literal devil look at Warhammer 40K, realize it's a management problem he can't solve, but also can't walk away from, and decide to govern it, one soul at a time anyway. Your turn. Who is the next character you want to see dropped into a universe that has absolutely no idea what to do with them? Could be another 40K crossover, could be a completely different world. Could be something that's going to make me lose sleep for 6 weeks, and I'm doing it anyway. Drop your pick in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I genuinely read every single one. And if you want more of this, more crossovers, more lore, more moments where two completely different mythologies collide at full speed, and neither of them survives the impact, gracefully drop a like and hit subscribe. It takes 2 seconds, and it means I get to keep